From the banks of Dewey Lake, it's the Dewey Pod Monster.
Welcome back. My name is John, and this is the Dewey Pod Monster Podcast. This is your weekly podcast about consumption. We are proud members of the Run Podcast Network. You'll find all of our previous episodes, all of our upcoming episodes, and all of the other great shows that are on the You Run Podcast Network at yourunpodcast.com. With me this week is the host of the Dewey Pod Monster Podcast, and his name is Sean. Sean, how are you doing this evening?
John, I'm sorry I don't speak Japanese.
That's okay. We don't need it for this movie.
Good. Perfect.
So, Japanese aside, what have you been watching this week?
I got a few things under my belt. I watched, where to start? So many things to talk about. So I will talk about something that I know.
Something that you've watched.
I'll start with something I know you haven't watched, and we'll go from there. So I watched, there's a little show on HBO. I think it premiered in 2015. It's called The Jinx, and it follows not Fred Durst, nobody related to Fred Durst, but Robert Durst, who is like this guy who his family owns a bunch of real estate in New York. I'm going to be real basic about it because I can't remember a lot about what the first Jinx was about in 2015, but I remember watching it when it came out. And Bob Durst he ran this real estate firm in New York. His family was very wealthy, like valued at $500 million at the time in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, probably a lot of money these days still. And back then he was convicted. Well, he wasn't convicted, but he was put on trial for dismembering a neighbor. And his neighbor, somehow he got off. Yeah, as you do. Somehow he got off the murder plea and dismemberment and whatnot. And two other
a big
people.
Afro or something like a white guy afro? Or
no.
Am I thinking of someone else? Okay.
You're thinking of somebody else. He looked like an old white guy. It was revealed kind of in his past that his wife disappeared and a friend of his disappeared or was murdered. Well, she didn't disappear. She was murdered. It was an unsolved murder. And this whole documentary, The Jinx, Andrew Jarecki, I think is the director's name, interviewed Robert Durst, and he kind of went over these different things, these occurrences in his life and how it was weird. And they kind of got into his backstory about his mom and his family and, you know, the whole thing. So at the big main takeaway from the first Jinx, spoiler alert if you haven't watched it, is at the end, the last episode's a 6-part series. The last episode, he's like, after this round of questioning from the director, he's like, do you mind if I use the bathroom? And the director says, sure. And unbeknownst to Bob Durst, he has a lapel mic and it's still on. It's a hot mic. And he goes into the bathroom and he says something to the effect of, you know, I did it. I can't believe I did it. You know, he basically confesses on a live mic or a hot mic in the bathroom. So
how could you not realize you still
have
the
mic?
But anyway.
So anyways, The Jinx Part 2 picks up a couple years after, and it goes into, I watched this all in one day. Like I totally binged it. I had heard some podcasts talk about The Jinx, and I ended up watching it
half-hour episodes
myself.
Or hour
No,
episodes?
They're like an hour, at least an hour
plus. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're like 57 minutes. So it's a 6-episode thing.
Sounds
I watched
about right
it
for an HBO show.
Yeah, I watched it straight through, and it essentially goes through his case. Like he gets charged with these things, and it's this really just crazy, insane story of how he's got all these people that are kind of dependent upon him to pay bills. And he also has this big trust that he has a bunch of money in, and it kind of goes through the trial. And as like when they initially do the first series with him, he's you know, he's pretty rough. Like he's all there. Like he's got all his faculties. He's not totally like gone yet. But as the time progressed, he aged very quickly. And
this guy just got out of jail, didn't
decrepit. No, he died. He didn't get out of jail. But
all right.
Yeah,
no, you're right.
Maybe you're thinking of somebody else. But
no, there was some
Bob
guy
Durst,
in his 90s that got released like yesterday or today, and not far from here. So for those,
this is not Bob. That was not Bob Durst.
I just saw a picture
Not
of
Fred
him, and I
Durst's
was like, oh, he
grandfather.
looks. Maybe. I mean,
got white hair.
Yeah.
But anyways, the Jinx 2 kind of follows that whole story. And if you're into true crime, or if you're into, I don't know, I want to say that like mystery documentary, true crime adjacent thing that HBO does, this is a continuation of that story. It's really interesting. There's a lot of twists and turns, too many to get into on this podcast. I mean, we'd have to start our own podcast, I think, to actually go through all that stuff. And I'm sure you don't want to subject yourself to that. I might be down for it, but it's the Jinx Part 2. It came out, I want to say 2019. So it's a few years old by now, but it is very interesting. If you, like me, I just never followed up. I knew Part 2 was out. I'm like, the guy, he confessed to doing it. What's there to watch? You know, what's there to know? And watching this a few years after, like, oh yeah, that thing, whatever happened with that? Very, very intriguing. Like I really, really was like enthralled with this 6-hour thing that took up 6 hours of my Friday, the beginning of my weekend. Can't complain about that part, but yeah, it was just really interesting. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about, I think we're going to have a little bit of discussion about it, probably, I don't know how long, but I watched, and I think you watched and finished. We both finished, I think, unless I'm wrong. In Search of Darkness.
Sometimes we lie about who finishes when.
Yeah, true. Sometimes you lie about what color it is. Yeah. 1990 to 1994, which basically retreads the same kind of tread, I guess, that In Search of Darkness 1 through 3 captured with 80s horror. This is 1990 to 1994. And it's what, about 6 hours, another 6 hours of
it's right around there.
Horror nostalgia, essentially.
Yeah. And I know you had a couple opinions about it. I remember the first thing I had said, I know I already said this to you. This is one of the few things we've kind of talked about before we've talked about it on here. My big takeaway from it is that Frank Henenlotter is absolutely fucking delightful. He's on this a lot because they cover Basket Case 2 and Frankenhooker, and I think they talk about Brain Dead also. Like, they talk about several of his movies and movies that he's been involved with, and I just love the guy because he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and like he looks like he doesn't give a shit when they're talking to him, but he's always like talking about how he get production notes like, make this scary, make this whatever. He's like, I want to make it stupid and have horrors and boobs and gore. I'm like, this guy's fucking great. This guy is a national treasure. So
right up my alley.
Yeah, I liked him a lot. It does feel like it's kind of following the same basic concept of the first three films, where what's different is this feels like it, to me, I felt like this tries to stick more to the chronological part with it and doesn't break the other one, like, and again, it's been probably 2 years since I watched the first three now. So, but what I remember, the first one was kind of like the whole 80s decade, but they did a lot, and these are all 6 hours too, so or 6-ish hours, so take that for what it's worth if you haven't seen them. So the first one was all like the AAA big titles, the stuff that everyone knows, the Friday the 13th, the Child's Play, the Nightmare, those types of movies that, like,
the headliners,
no matter how,
the hits.
the ones that no matter how big a horror fan you are, you've probably heard of them. The second one was more of like the VHS craze, so the stuff, frankly, the stuff like you and I like, the good shit to like
the good stuff.
Yeah, good shit to sometimes bad shit. And then from, again, if I'm remember right, the third one had kind of whatever was left over plus a lot of like foreign movies. From
a lot of direct-to-video, I think.
Yeah, and I remember a lot of like, I think that's where they got into some of the giallo stuff and some of the like just non-American horror, and that's fine too. Fucking no one else can do horror except for America, and what we're going to talk about.
We spread
in
horror
15 minutes
and inflict it on ourselves.
I mean, kind of. This one, I think it felt more like they were going more chronologically, as like they never, although they talk about movies, like they reference them from all over the 90s and all the way back, I think as far as like the 70s, maybe even the 60s in a couple cases. I don't remember a whole lot of like super new movies, maybe one or two sprinkled in here there. It's like, oh yeah, this so-and-so stole this from this movie type thing. They do more like, you're going to spend 2 hours in 1990, then you're going to spend 2 hours in 1991, and the interludes between there is where they do the like, they still have the little like side story pieces. It's like, oh, CG was becoming a thing or whatever, or sci-fi kind of found its way into horror. Like those little side quests that they go on in this, they are less fleshed out, I felt like. And I don't want to say they're glossed over because I feel like that's almost, again, for a 6-hour documentary, I feel like that'd be doing it a disservice. But at least for me, I can't tell if the 90s are a generation that, although it has some films in it that I truly love, 90 through 94 has really hammered home why I feel like I really love the 80s as a horror decade way more than I like the 90s. And maybe that's where you're at with it too. I don't know.
Well, I just felt like in this installment, and to mention, we interviewed David Weiner, I don't know, 2 years ago when we kind of finished the thing, and the original 3 documentaries, he was in the process of kind of putting.
They were
this
just
thing
getting
together.
started at this point, so
right.
Or at that point.
So, and if you want to go back and listen to it, we'll have it linked in the show notes. But yeah, for me, it seemed like a lot of it. What they did this time around is because they did it chronologically and they didn't break it up into the 3 sections like they did for the 80s. It felt like they mixed a lot of it together, and a lot of it felt like we're going to talk about this foreign horror movie that you may have never heard of, which was kind of nice to see these movies that you hadn't heard of. But I feel like you could tell that they spent a lot of time and a lot of time on movies with the people that they could get that were involved with these movies. So if they were able to get a few other people that maybe, like the guy that did Nekromantik and did, I forgot one of the other ones. They have him like that 2 or 3 different times.
He is on there a lot.
Yeah.
So,
and it's like we had access to this guy.
And I honestly don't feel like he had a whole lot of interesting shit to say. Maybe when he was talking about Necromantics, but that movie's fucked up enough to begin with that I don't really need to hear anyone's opinion on it.
And if you're not familiar with what Nekromantik is, maybe we'll leave a link to that in the show notes, but probably not the movie. But
it pops up on Tubi fairly often. So
it's on Tubi? Okay.
I know I've seen both of them on there, but anyway.
Anyway, I felt like because they mixed everything together in this one, it kind of, there were a lot of movies or a lot of things that just kind of outshined the things that you wanted to see. And the thing that they've done in part 1, 2, and 3 is, if you hadn't seen them, is they have this thing where they'll show a wall essentially of like covers or posters or VHS tapes or whatever. And they'll kind of skim over these VHS tapes and you'll see all these titles you might recognize if you were ever one of those like aisle crawlers in the video store where you checked out all the covers because you were trying to figure out what to rent.
Basically, if you listen to this show, you probably would love just watching this.
Yeah, just watching the covers fly by.
Like, yeah.
And they do that with this, but I felt like especially as it got towards the end, you would see all these interesting covers and you're like, I remember that movie. I really hope they talk about it. And instead, what they would do is they would focus on the one that was like the popular movie at the time, or the I don't want to say blockbuster, but the one that was like the hit, or the one that you knew about, or they talked about Child's Play a few times because they had the writer of Child's Play. So they, like I said, it felt like this one was a lot more dictated with having a shorter turnaround time and them having access to these people to talk to them. Like Heather Langenkamp is in it a lot. And that's great. She's great. I mean, she provides a ton of information. Like the other person that I made a comment over text off mic was Michael Gross from Tremors, from Family Ties. He played a pivotal role, right? Because he was in Tremors and all the sequels and everything. But they have him talking about movies that he has no involvement in. And it's like, it's great that he has that insight to talk about these things, because if you only knew him, if you didn't know that he did all these other movies and you only knew him from his 80s career, which was the dad on Family Ties, you would be like, why is Michael Gross talking about any of this? Like, what does he have to do with any of this? Oh, he happened to be in Tremors. Oh, he's been in a ton of like B movies and low budget, just every kind of movie since. And that's not minimizing his acting ability or anything, but it's just kind of like, okay, that's cool, but why are we talking to Michael Gross or Doug Bradley, right? He's the guy that plays Pinhead. He's in a few things, but he's also been in other things besides Hellraiser. So I know one of the things he was in, that David Cronenberg movie that I can never remember the name of, where they're all the demons or whatever, but they're like good demons, and Cronenberg actually acts in the movie.
Yeah, I forget what
I
it's
can't
called
remember
too.
what
they
the
go
name
on
of the
that
movie
one
is,
for.
but
They talk about that one for a long time too.
Yeah, and you're kind of like, these were footnotes, I felt like, in the 90s, and there were so many movies that I saw the cover fly by that I'm like, please stop on this one. Please stop on this one. They'd stop on the screen with it, but they'd talk about the movie you didn't want them to talk about at all. So it was a little disappointing in that respect.
I also wonder how much of this is footage that was from the first 3 movies that they shot, specifically with guys like Carpenter. And I know the stuff with Tom Sweeney that's in there I've seen on like a million places. So I know like some of his, they're talking about him, or they're talking to him, or someone's talking to him when they go on about his remake of Night of the Living Dead. And I know I've seen that interview like 10 years ago. Now, whether he did that initially for In Search of Darkness the first time around, that's entirely possible. But I know where they got that particular clip was not like a new interview, and that's fine. Like, you don't, if that footage is readily available, I guess you don't necessarily have to go hunt down Tom Sweeney just to have him tell the same story again. If it looks good and sounds good, go for it. But the other one that really stuck out was Carpenter, because he's in this, but he's not in it a lot. And I say he looks exactly the same as he did in the last one. And the only reason I would question, because I mean, usually when you see John Carpenter, it's just like black head to toe, and he might or might not be awake, depending on what time of day you catch him. And if I remember right, I think they interviewed him in his house in the first set of movies. So it wouldn't be weird that they're doing that again in the second house. So it's entirely possible they could have shown up and he had like 2 sentences worth of things to say in this movie, maybe. But it did kind of feel like, all right, we're just going to use whatever we stumbled on from the last conversations and kind of clip it into this. And again, that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't feel like Carpenter specifically contributed nearly as much in conversation to this as he did to the previous set of films. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. Like, some of these people they get, although it's not that you don't necessarily appreciate their insight, it's also not necessarily the person whose insight you want. And it would be, I know this is impossible, but it would have been really nice to have like Wes Craven available to talk for this, because there's so many films from the 90s. Well, 2 specifically. There's New Nightmare, which they do a good chunk on New Nightmare, and there's Scream, which they wouldn't do Scream yet because that's 96. But, he's a guy that I feel like he was more prolific in the 90s probably than he was in the 80s, or debatable, I guess. Like, he still had Nightmare and People Under the Stairs. Was that the 90s or was that the 80s?
I feel like it was really early 90s, like 91, maybe?
Yeah. So, just like, I don't know, I've said it before, I think him and Carpenter are the 2 best horror directors, period. Like, they're the guys. And you could ask me on any given day, and I might flip a coin and say I like one more this day, one the other day. So I feel like he's a big, like, having even like archival footage of him talking about any of these films, because I'm sure that's out there. Like, he's got to have been interviewed about, especially about New Nightmare, before he passed. Like, I feel like having more of that would have been good to put in there, even if it wasn't a new recording, since I'm 95% sure they did it with other people. Why not him too?
So for me, long story short, it's like when your kid does something bad and you're like, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. Like, I was kind of underwhelmed. I was not hyped to see it because I know what to expect. We know what to expect. Yeah. We've seen the first 3 episodes, or the first 3, not episodes, but versions of this.
Right.
And I was just hoping that it would be not even necessarily a step up, but just kind of continuing that bar. And I feel like the way that they condensed it all into having one section of a 6-hour movie be these first 4-5 years or whatever, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, it was just kind of underwhelming. So I was just a little disappointed in it. But I mean, I'm looking forward to the next one and hoping that it kind of comes back to form. And it also could be the movies of the time. I mean, I wasn't unfamiliar with too many of them, but
I think that's the bigger thing for me. Like, it's not that I'm unfamiliar with, or even that I don't like these movies necessarily, but it's also a really weird transition period for film in general. I feel like, for me, the 90s was more like action really took off in the 90s, like action films, like that's where you get your Con Airs and a lot of your, Nick Cage going apeshit movies and, Stallone movies, Schwarzenegger movies. Those were bigger and more over the top in the 90s. Yes, they were in the 80s too, but they just amped all that up in the 90s. There's this this like concept that people have said forever, like Wes Craven saved horror when he did Scream in 96. So if that's the argument, and I don't agree with that argument for whatever it's worth. I think horror would have been just fine had Scream not been made, but I don't think you can make the argument. You can argue against the fact that that movie redefined or reinvigorated the genre, popular from a popularity standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what, let's just say for the sake of argument that horror was dying up until 1996 when that came out. Watching this, there's a lot more movies that I'm like, this is fine, but like I'd rather watch insert movie here than this. And you know, it's not that it's a bad decade. It's definitely not that. It's just there's a lot more movies I found myself losing interest in, at least the ones that they picked to talk about. So, and there's other stuff too. Like I would have liked to seen more. I can't think of his name now, but the guy who did the effects on Jurassic Park, the primary dude, because they do a big thing talking about I can't think of his name, and I would know it like the guy who designed the T-Rex, how it moved and how it worked with the animatronics and the CG for it. Yeah. And I don't know why he might have been Stan Winston. Is that it?
Guy? That sounds familiar.
I've seen extensive interviews with him talking about it. So I know those conversations have been had. So I don't know if he just wasn't available to have another conversation and they didn't want to pull that previous stuff or not, but they didn't. For as big as a movie that was, I don't feel like they spent a lot of time on that movie, which is okay. Like, I've seen that movie a million times. I don't think I need to have that broken down all over again. But it feels like with how much that movie really pushed the envelope on practical effects, all that stuff. And again, if we're considering Jurassic Park a horror movie, which I think is fair, it's definitely a creature feature, so it falls in that genre. I mean, that's just as big a movie as Scream was 3 years later, I would think, if not bigger.
Yeah, for the movie industry as a whole. We talked about Terminator 2 a couple weeks ago. It's just as influential on CG and computer effects as any movie, maybe outside Terminator, probably including Terminator 2. So yeah, it has a big impact, but yeah. Like I said, a little underwhelmed, a little disappointed, but looking forward to the next one, hoping it's a little bit better.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, again, it's already a series that's won me over. Like, I watched that, and I watched the sci-fi one, what was that? In Search of Tomorrow. I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I could sit through, 20 hours of those plus 6 hours of this, I'll keep watching them, obviously. But I agree with you. I like this more than the science fiction one, but of the 4 horror movie ones, this is pretty solidly in fourth for me right now, if I had to rank them.
Same.
Hey, we've gone on long enough about stuff that we've watched now, so had a feeling that might happen. So we'll save everything else for next week, and then we're going to take a quick break here. We're going to switch gears and come back and talk about a horror movie that is not from the 90s, it is not from the 80s, but it's Norwegian, so that's kind of cool.
That's something.
Yeah. So we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about Troll.
Hi everyone, AI John here. Did you know that we're on the You Run Podcast Network? YouRunPodcast.com is home to great shows like You Gonna Eat That Crust, Pop Culture Reflections Podcast, Voices of the Mausoleum, and many more. Head over to YouRunPodcast.com and find your new favorite show today.
So we are back, and as mentioned, we're going to be talking about a movie from 2010, and it is called Troll Hunter. We are going to start with a third-party review. This one is on Letterboxd because I read too many on Rotten Tomatoes and got bored with them. They're all basically the same thing. Either I love it or I hate it. There was really no talking in it, so those aren't fun. So we go over to Letterboxd, and Willie J717 says, "It's a real conversation. Where are all the troll dicks? Overall, the movie's fine, but spends way too much time on people talking about trolls rather than showing us the trolls. When they do, I don't feel like it's very satisfying. Also, some Troy Grundle could be good." I don't really know what Grundle is, but
let's not get into that.
Willie J gives it 2 out of 5 stars and says, again, where are all the troll dicks?
That's a great question. What's his
That's
name?
a good question.
Trolly
Willie
D. What's his name?
J.
Willie J.
717.
Trolly D. Willie J.
Troy D.
Same diff.
Troy D is a better name. I should have put that on my sign-in thing here.
Yeah.
So what's this movie about, Sean?
That should be your new letterbox handle. So for that, we go to IMDb. We look up the name Troll Hunter, or as it's known in Norwegian, Trolljegeren. And we find that it gets a 6.9 out of 10 with 81,000 ratings. It's been a few weeks since we've had anything with any kind of ranking. This has no ranking, so don't get excited. We go to the storyline and the plot. That's where we start. Not sure which one's which, but we go to the one that's on the top because they wouldn't want you to read it first if it wasn't on the top. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. It says a group of sturds. A group of students investigates a series of mysterious bear killings, but learns that there are much more dangerous things going on. They start to follow a mysterious hunter, learning that he is actually a troll hunter. And if we scroll on down to the bottom, this is listed as the storyline. And this one comes care of Claudio Carvalho from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It says, when bears are found dead in Norway, students from Volda University decide to investigate. They stalk the trail of the mysterious hunter Hans, expecting to find an explanation for the killings. The reluctant Hans tries to flee from the youngsters, but then agrees to let them film him in action, provided they follow his orders. Soon the trio of students learns that Hans is actually a troll hunter working for a secret government agency. Further, several dangerous trolls have escaped from their territory, and Hans is assigned to eliminate them.
I don't feel like he was trying to flee from them. I feel like he was telling them to fuck off, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't a willing participant at first, but he came around because he wanted to expose that government bureaucracy.
Wanted to blackmail. So, Sean, I know I had seen this movie quite a while ago, so this is not a new one for me. This one came up, quite frankly, because I said I wanted an excuse to rewatch this movie. I haven't watched it in a while, which happens on this show from time to time. So I can't really say where I know these people from because they're all from this movie. Is there anyone in this cast that is worth mentioning?
I mean, I don't recognize anybody from anything other than this movie, but I'm sure that they have credits. Like if we look at Hans, who's played by Otto Jespersen, which sounds like the most Norwegian name probably ever. He has a ton of, well, not a ton. He has 18 credits. He was on Crypto Kings, which I think is a show that they speak English in. We'll just go by what IMDb has. There are pictures next to these people's names, so I'm assuming, and they don't look like they're all from this movie. A few look like they could be. So they look like they may have other credits, but I feel like most of these people, other than Jen Stoltenberg, probably are not known in America, and Jen Stoltenberg probably isn't known either outside of America or outside of Norway. But yeah, I would say most of these people are probably Norwegian and don't have much of a presence in the good old US of A.
Is this your first watch with this movie?
I am going to say no, but I know that I've seen bits and pieces, or I had seen bits and pieces, and I was very familiar with this movie. I'm going to be perfectly frank. When we watched Rare Exports, I actually thought Rare Exports, before I watched Rare Exports, was this movie. So I got them somehow, wires were crossed. We talked about Rare Exports like 2 Christmases ago, I think. That's a finished movie.
It was our first year.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was really confused at first when I started Rare Exports and it didn't have troll hunting, because I thought for some reason Santa was a troll. But yeah, I'd seen bits and pieces of this, but I don't know if I'd ever finished it. I think this used to be on Netflix, and I'm not sure if it still is, but I know at one point, that it was on Netflix, and I know I watched some way back when Netflix like first started actually streaming movies other than, rather than getting them through the mail. But this is my first complete watch through.
I don't know if this still pops onto Netflix. It's one of those movies that kind of bounces from streaming service to streaming service. So like looking at it just at a glance right now on IMDb, it's saying Max and Roku channel plus 2 others. I didn't expand it. We'll have links in the show notes for you.
Absolutely.
But I know I've seen it on Tubi. I know I've seen it on Hulu, and I'm pretty sure I've seen it in the last year or 2 on Netflix. So it's one of those that whenever you listen to this, if you don't listen to it when it's new, if it's not on wherever we link it to, if you are interested in finding this, just go to Just Watch. It's probably going to be available somewhere. It's worth mentioning too, this is the director André Øvredal, maybe. This is his first film or first full-length film. He's got a couple short films before this, or I'm assuming student-type projects. You might recognize him, though, he also did The Autopsy of Jane Doe and that recent Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie. He has a handful of other things, too, but I think those are, aside from this, the titles that you might recognize from.
Yeah, also Last Voyage of the Demeter, just to throw that one out there.
I'm not familiar with that one, but okay. He did do that.
He did do that.
This is also probably one of the, I'd say, first movies that really made me like found footage. I know it's not one of the first found footage movies out there. Like, there's plenty that came well before this. But this is a found footage style film. This is 100% like, and it's all budgetary reasons why they did it this way, I'm sure. At least that's what I'm pretty sure I've heard before. But it's 100% like these three students go and start making this film. They don't exactly know what they're getting themselves into, and it kind of escalates from there. I will say this is the kind of found footage film that I like, because this film, it's not a ton of shaky cam. Like, the shaky cam stuff just annoys me. Like, and I know that's a preference thing. Like, some people like it. Especially if you see a movie like this in a theater, fucking hate it.
That's a lot of shaking going on in like a big screen.
Yeah.
That you're supposed to be immersed into, so I can understand that. Yeah.
So it's just not my thing. But to those who like it, good for you. This does a really good job of taking, this probably predates the days where you could shoot a movie all on your cell phone by, I'd say, probably at least 5 years. But this really does a good job of just taking a really minimal approach and doing a really good job of drawing you into the story. There was a couple of the reviews I was reading when I was looking for a third-party review that people thought this was an actual documentary.
Yeah.
I thought about reading that, but I can't confirm or deny that they actually think this is a documentary. If they do, okay. But it kind of has that like feeling of a documentary film, the way that it's shot. It plays into that found footage thing, but as the movie progresses, they do a really good job for this style of film in presenting a scope that makes these creatures that show up feel as big as they're supposed to be in the movie. It makes the danger presented by these things, although you kind of get the impression they're stupid enough that you could probably maneuver around them moderately easily, or at least to some degree. They do a good job of conveying danger, scale, and scope in this better than, honestly, probably any other found footage movie that I can think of. And I can't think of another found footage monster movie that has this kind of, the only one that comes to mind is Cloverfield, and that had way more of a budget than what this did. So,
and they do tell you at the onset of the movie that they tell you basically this is found footage. They say that this is footage that was found on a hard drive, like on the side of the road, essentially. This was the only thing that was recovered. These, however, 2.5 hours or whatever of footage that they had, this is like in chronological order. Watching this movie this time, like front to back, gave me real strong, and all the things that you mentioned gave me real strong Blair Witch vibes. Like, Blair Witch was not a creature feature. I mean, there is like a creature, so to speak, and something that you don't really see much in that movie. But
you just see it in the second movie and not the first movie.
I never saw the second. So okay. I've relayed on the show several times. John's very sick of probably hearing this, right, John? You're very sick of hearing that. When I saw Blair Witch, I knew that it was not a real movie. I knew that it wasn't like real footage. But Sci-Fi did a special. They talked about it. I had seen something that said, hey, this is not a real movie, but this is this budget, blah, 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 blah. When I went and saw it in the theater, people around me, when we walked out, we saw it opening night in a real small, like art style theater. People were convinced that this was like real footage. And I could see someone watching this and believing that too, because even at the end, when I mentioned the whole IMDb thing and Jen Stoltenberger, he is was the prime minister of Norway, and he's in this movie as himself, but it's like archival footage that they've done some, camera trickery to make it look like he's in there with another character from the movie, like he's giving a press conference and it was from a real conference. But I just felt like you said, like our third-party reviewer kind of mentioned how they don't really show that they need to show more trolls, they need to show it more. And I think this movie, with its less is more approach, makes it so that when you do see the trolls on screen, it feels real because you see them so sparingly that they, for whatever little budget they used on this, I don't know what the budget was off the top of my head.
It's about $3.5 million, I think is what I read, something like that.
It feels like most of that is probably the effects. And they do such a good job because they have them on screen for such short bursts. And you said it's not so shaky cam. It's not super shaky cam, but it is like, I mean, it's a guy filming with a camcorder or some kind of, handheld camera. There is some shaky cam to it, but it works so well because they don't show the trolls that much. And I feel like it's convincing in that way. So they know when to pick and choose when to show these monsters. And when they do, it makes more of an impact because they're on screen for such a short amount of time.
Well, they do a really good job with the color palette too. And this is still relatively early CG. So I mentioned the color palette because up until the end of the movie, the first, I think 3 or 4 trolls that you see are all in the dark and they're kind of lit up by a flash or something like that.
Or night vision or something.
Yeah, you don't see a ton of them until they get to the bridge, and then you see a little bit more of them as the movie goes on, and they almost always look almost like they're camouflaged into the background, the way that they do it. And I think it's actually really smart because how they animated these characters in. And I know there's some effects that they do that are practical, like when they smash them with a hammer and stuff, but I think it's a good job because it hides a lot of the imperfections that the CG has. I'd be willing to bet if you wanted to take the time and get a Blu-ray of this and pause it frame by frame on these characters, they're going to look pretty bad. Like if you really zoom in on them and whatever, but if you let the movie be the movie and just kind of watch it in real time, it doesn't ever show you enough to take you out of it. And even when we get to the finale where you do see this thing essentially in daylight, they say it's dusk, and you could question the logic there based off the rules of these trolls, whatever, as to how effective this thing is in daylight. That's a different conversation. But even when they get to that, the way they shoot this thing, it's far enough out of frame that it still looks pretty good. You buy this like David versus Goliath battle that's going on between this big fucking troll and this crazy Norwegian dude named Hans, basically.
Well, the thing, I'll be the devil's advocate. This movie's all bullshit because they don't have big hair. And it's not like all these different multicolors. Fuck that shit.
There's no jewels in their bellies.
Yeah, there's no jewels in the bellies. What a bunch of bullshit. No, but when they show the trolls, the thing that they do, I think
if you don't know what we're talking about, search trolls from like 1990. You can probably.
There's a whole series of trolls movies with Justin Timberlake as actors, and
never mind.
John, you don't have kids,
yeah.
But this is obvious. But they show the trolls for Troll Hunter, not for Trolls the movie. They show the trolls in the dark. They show them under night vision, or they show the only time they show a troll, like by the time they show them in full daylight, it's like this huge, like you mentioned, the Goliath, like huge troll. So they can do this. They can spend the time to flesh out the troll and have them be this huge thing, and they're not multicolored, like they're not super colorful things. But, as we go along in the movie, like Hans is not a willing participant at first. Hans is the troll hunter. You find out he's like the only troll hunter in Norway. And they don't really they kind of hint at it a little bit, but they don't really go into anything where they say that trolls are anything other than, like, there's no other troll hunters in the world. So you kind of get the impression that there's no trolls other than in Norway. And I know that, like, Norwegian culture, trolls are kind of like they're like our Sasquatch, or they're, our Dewey Lake monster. So
Mothman.
Yeah. Just our kind of cryptid, American cryptid. They're like the Norwegian cryptid. And I think it's really kind of fun that they have like this whole lore built into the story where there's different trolls in different territories, and they're different kinds of trolls, and they're trolls that, like you mentioned earlier, Hans mentions how Yeah, they're not really smart. Like there's the first troll that we meet. I don't remember what the name of the troll species is, but he's got 3 heads. And he's like, well, really, they only have 1 head. The other ones are just these protuberances that are there to intimidate other trolls. You know, when they get flashed with a high UV I don't know,
light.
a high like burst of UV light, it can either turn them to stone or it can make them explode. And we go through the movie and we meet a person that helps Hans with like taking blood samples, and they analyze the blood samples, and they're like, well, why? They even explain like why some freeze or why they turn to stone and why some explode. So they really go very deep into the lore of like how to legitimize these different creatures in this movie. And I don't know, it just makes it kind of fun. It's not like it's clinical in a way, but it's also fun. It feels like the filmmakers, the actors, everybody really covers all their bases as to, like you said, there's a little bit of a leap of logic at the end of the movie, but I feel like as the movie goes on, they do their best to try and explain like why things are the way they are. And there's this whole thing, one of the subplots is like, and they just kind of mention it offhandedly at the beginning, like, hey, are any of you guys Christian? And they're like, no, nobody's Christian. Like, you don't believe in God. And they're like, no, we don't believe, you know, we're not Christian. And it comes to a point later where one of the characters,
we're going to put it in here now and give your spoiler warning if you haven't seen this, because this is something that I want to talk about. So if you haven't seen Troll Hunter and care about spoilers, go ahead and pause it.
Pause it? Are they going to watch the whole movie and then come back?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great.
So
I'm with you.
But go ahead. Christian blood.
Well, yeah, if you're Christian, like the trolls can smell you out, or they can figure it out. And what they do is they use this, like, I don't know, it's troll goop or something, and they rub it on their clothes, and that's supposed to hide their scent, so the troll doesn't realize that they're there. And one of the characters ends up like not confessing, no pun intended, that he is Christian. I guess that's more of a Catholic thing, but he doesn't mention that he's Christian, but he is, and he starts to lose it. Like he flips out because they're in this enclosed space with a couple of really stupid trolls that aren't going to know that they're there. But I found it humorous, but also kind of like suspenseful at the same time, that Hans is like, hey man, you need to stop sweating because they're going to smell you. And he then confesses like, oh, I'm Christian. Like
meanwhile,
I
Hans is like
Jesus.
dozing off and falling asleep.
Right. It's just another day in the office for him. But for this other character, which I won't mention who it is, he's losing his shit. And I thought that they were like, because these are college students, it makes sense that there's this like camaraderie between these 3 college students. And there's this like sense of, I don't know, humor between the 3 of them because they're all familiar with each other. So they play off each other really well, even though 2 of them are willing participants, and one of them always, it kind of feels like it changes. One of them always feels like because there's 2 males and 1 female. One of them always feels like they're not along for the ride. And I like that dynamic that all those players kind of play off each other with in this movie.
So there's 2 things I want to bring up in regard to the Christian blood or the Christians that really make me laugh in this. I love when they're trying to bait a troll to get a blood sample, and Hans has this like very homemade like suit of armor looking bullshit. Like he looks like
yeah.
Do you remember
when Iron Man comes out of the cave?
It made me think of the Bud Light night when he came out with the Dilly Dilly guy which would have been after this movie, but that like stupid, like very shitty looking suit of armor. And I love that he's like, you better stay the fuck back. I'm going to throw some Christian blood down to, you know, tempt him.
Yeah, draw him
out. He does. And this troll comes and just fucks him up. And like the most comical, like he ragdolls this guy. And Hans is like kind of portrayed as like the biggest dude of this group by far. He's not like Schwarzenegger running around or nothing, but he looks like, you know, rough hunter type guy.
Definitely grizzled.
Yeah, he just gets roughed the fuck up by this troll, and I don't know why it's so funny to me every time that it happens, but I laugh. And then I like so the character that you're referring to in the cave, who confesses he's a Christian, then that's basically the end of him. I love how no one ever questions the fact that this human is just gone. You know,
Yeah.
No question at all. No,
They're kind of sad
no.
for about 5 minutes, and then they move on.
But I
quickly.
like that even more so. They go to replace him. They get this person off the bus, and they're like, so she gets shipped in or trained in or whatever. She shows up, and they're like, okay, well, thank you for coming. We're glad you can help us. By the way, are you Christian?
Are you
She's
Christian?
like, no. They ask her like 3 times. She says no. She goes, no, I'm Muslim. He goes, oh, that's cool. They go over to Hans. They're like, she says she's Muslim. Is that cool? He goes, I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. We're just off to fight another troll. And I always love that line because it's like, what a dipshit way to do it. But like, it almost leads to like, I don't think they inform this new 3rd or 4th person to the party, like the new person that gets added in, what she's about to go up against. They just question her faith, and then they're like, well, it's not Christian, so it's probably fine.
Yeah,
So,
it should be good.
and that's kind of where the humor is. Some of the humor is in this movie. It's very grounded, real world conversation type responses. It's not comedy like no one's coming out here and playing, the Benny Hill song and like kicking someone in the balls and running around like that. The humor that's in it feels grounded and like the type of, I don't want to call them stupid responses, but the type of like borderline uneducated, dumb responses that you would have just from having 4 people that don't really know each other, or 3 people that do and 1 that doesn't, just being in this weird situation. So I think it really works in this. I will say this time I watched the dub track. When I've watched it in the past, I've only watched it subtitled. The dub track does no favors for this fucking movie. Like, it's a very bad dub. It sounds very like, think like early Godzilla, where it just sounds like they're doing a American caricature of everyone. And it almost makes them all sound a little Looney Toony, where you almost get I don't know if it's suspense or tension or something. It just builds way better without the dubbing track.
I did it with both. I watched a version where I could play like an English dub and an English sub. So I got the best. I kind of like picked and chose.
Mhm.
I think I mostly relied on the subtitle more, but I went back and forth, and I didn't think the dubbing was bad. I just don't understand how that whole thing works, like that localization works. So I always wonder why. Well, not always, but sometimes you'll watch a movie and the dubbing will be like a direct reading of the subtitle. But then you'll get movies like this where they're just like different enough. And sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. So that's kind of, I like doing it that way because you can kind of pick and choose and you're like, why did they say it that way? Like, oh, okay, the subtitle said it this way. Or the subtitle says it some weird way, but they speak it more naturally. And I kind of appreciate it that way. So it was nice that I could kind of go both ways on it. But yeah, I noticed that sometimes the subtitle would be more often than not matching the tone a little bit better than the dubbing did. But I didn't have much of a problem, going between the two, kind of like coalescing them together.
I think if I hadn't seen it previously without the dubbing track, I wouldn't think that. So maybe it doesn't really matter. But having seen it without I didn't even know there was a subbed dubbed track for this film until this time around. So outside of, Christian manhandling and, angry trolls, what other things did you like about this movie?
I just like the whole feeling of this bureaucracy where they're in the background of all this going on. There's Finn, who is supposed to be this like government, I don't know, I want to say like a wildlife, some kind of administrative contact in the wildlife department. Yeah, bureaucrat. And he's going in front of the media to say, oh, these are definitely bear attacks. So every time one of these troll attacks will happen and people die, they will put this like this Polish group of guys in a painting van will come and they'll drop off these different bears, and they'll be, sometimes they might have a Norwegian bear, sometimes they have a Russian bear, and then this guy Finn has to explain or come up on the spot like, oh yeah, no, it was the reason it was Russian bears do this is why they did it a little bit differently. And he goes out there and there's actually like some parts where they show him where he's got like bear prints on his feet, and he has these little like walking sticks that have bear prints on them, and he'll have to like stomp around a little bit to make it look like the bear had some struggle before it died. And there's a few things where the students are they're in the background of this media shot, this news shot, and they're like, well, why was the bear like it was crossing its legs? And, something that bears just, you wouldn't expect them to do in public. And Finn is this administrator. He's actually part of the TSS, which is like the troll
security service or something like that.
Yeah. And he's trying to basically, anytime anything comes up where a troll attacks people, he's covering it up. So I like that whole subtext of like the government is trying to cover up this whole conspiracy, or they're creating a conspiracy, basically trying to cover up all this troll activity. And meanwhile, Hans is the one that has to get his hands dirty. He's like, I don't know, some kind of like special agent.
Says he's in the Navy, but that's not how he got this job, whatever that means. So
he's basically like an ex-Navy SEAL for an analog to the United States. So I like that whole kind of cover up feeling of the movie. I mean, I love myself a good government cover up and bureaucracy kind of in action. So I was really enjoying that whole kind of context, and it comes to a head later in the movie. Again, spoiler alert, and I'm not going to spoil the actual thing, but you should watch this thing if you're interested, where Finn is like, he becomes a real central character towards the end of this movie, and he's not happy. Like, there are certain characters, every character really questions the filming of this actual activity going on, where Hans is the first one. He's like, the dam broke, and he's like, no, that's cool. You can film me, like no big deal. And then he takes responsibility for all the other people in the quote unquote government that the students film. But Finn is always, he's like against it. And it becomes a bit of an issue as we get to the end of the movie, which I don't think we're going to like spoil it completely, but it becomes an issue. Let's put it that way.
For me, I just like how this movie feels very grounded and very, for a movie that's basically a monster movie. Like, at the end of the day, this is essentially a monster movie. Like, it's found footage, it's shot like a documentary, blah, blah, blah. But this is a movie about monsters that show up and humans are trying to fight them, essentially. I feel like they did a really good job of making this movie feel grounded and almost believable. It's believable that a government would cover up this kind of random, weird fucking thing. It's believable that there would be some kind of organization, even if it's one guy that keeps the monsters at bay, and that he would be pissed off because he's not getting paid enough or whatever and wants to blackmail his employer to, like, it just works really well as far as how they tell the story. And I mean, our guest reviewer said there's not enough time where there's, there needs to be more trolls on the screen. And I actually kind of disagree with that, because I think they do a really good job of building the story, building the characters. And there's not like a shit ton of dialogue in this movie. It's not, I wouldn't call it a dialogue heavy film. It's not a Kevin Smith movie where they're just talking to a camera for an hour and a half on end and then maybe a dick joke shows up. It's not that. I think it does a good job of just fleshing everything out and just telling a really good story. And if you get into the horror genre, as much as we both love it, there's a lot of movies that we both love that they don't necessarily do a great job of telling a story, fleshing out characters, or making it feel grounded in any type of believable way. And sometimes that's to a movie's credit, but when you can be essentially a monster movie and still kind of nail that, I think that says a lot.
I mean, I'm on the same page. For as much like as we talked about the dubbing and the subtitle, which we didn't really harp on it too much, but they really don't talk that much. It feels almost like it's like part found footage, part troll hunting, part like road trip movie, for as much as they drive around the countryside, just kind of showing these things and the interactions between these characters to kind of show the growth and camaraderie between the four of them. I was going to say three, but initially three.
It's really the three.
Four of them.
I mean, the fourth person, whether it's person four the first time or person four.
Well, I meant Hans as being that odd man out, but then he starts to become part of the group too.
I think once he brings himself into the group, the fourth person
is the cameraman.
Is the cameraman or camera woman. Yeah. I think the fourth person being the camera person, they really are the most forgettable of it, aside from the fact that what we already mentioned with the death and the Christian stuff. But I don't feel like they really, and maybe it's because they're the camera person, so you don't ever really see them that much. Like, they're always behind the camera.
Right.
I don't think they
contribute nearly as like I feel like if anyone's the third wheel, it's the camera person, not Hans or Johanna or Glenn, whatever his name is, blue coat guy with duct tape.
I don't think
It says Glenn on. It says Glenn on here. Or wait, no, Thomas. Is there anything you don't like about this movie?
I mean, it's just like nitpicky stuff. Like I think that at the beginning of the movie, when they're kind of following Hans around, there's this extended scene or scenes where they're following Hans around to try and figure out what he's up to. Because at the beginning of the movie, they don't know. They just know that there's this weird guy in town and that he's kind of been doing this suspicious thing. They think he's a bear poacher because I guess you have to have a license in Norway to shoot bears. And it's like a big deal to get this license because they have at the beginning of the movie these interviews with these bear hunters. And because all this bear activity of these people being killed, this Hans character is a mysterious character because he's always around where these different bears are being shot, which goes back to the whole TSS thing. And at the beginning of the movie, they're driving around and they're following him and he just has no idea. It's seemingly he's this troll hunter. He should almost have like an ESP about what's going on around him or be like super aware. And they're driving a green car, a green like hatchback that anybody could pick out of a lineup. And seemingly Hans has no idea that they're on his tail, like 90% of the first like 20 minutes of the movie. But that's really my biggest nitpick. I don't have much to really complain about with this movie.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. If I were going to force myself to nitpick something and take this with a grain of salt because it doesn't really bother me that much, the cave scene is where you really kind of feel the 2010s CG like more than I would like to. It's the only scene where I kind of feel like the trolls are animated in a way that almost could take you out of it. It's a pretty short scene, so you get through it kind of quick and you just kind of move on, but it's a lot of like night vision stuff and it just, I don't know. It serves its purpose. It looks fine. I'm sure if the director had the opportunity to redo it and make it look like he probably wanted to, I'm sure it would look better. But, for what this movie is, what the budget is, a first time like feature length filmmaker, I'm assuming a lot of these actors were first time actors or not a lot of credits under their belt at this point. It honestly feels like the most nitpicky of nitpicks that I could come up with. And I'm really only including it because it's the closest I can say to like an actual negative for this movie. So I might have tipped our hand, but what time is it?
Then you're in for a big treat, bro, because it's hot dog time.
Sean, you're batting leadoff. Go for it.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, I mean, it's going to be really easy for me. I'm a big fan of any movie that's a commentary on government bureaucracy and cover-ups. Like I said, I really like the technique that was used, that they only show the audience what they need to see when they need to see it. And I'm talking about the trolls. Like, they don't show them constantly. They only show them when it's pertinent to the story. And I feel like because you only get these glimpses of it, it's like any good horror movie. You only see the killer's face or you only see the big reveal when it's necessary. And that I feel like that's what makes it so convincing. I've already said it. It feels like a movie that's in the vein of the original Blair Witch, and it left some questions at the end, and that's my kind of movie. Like, I like movies where the end is totally open-ended. You feel like you have enough closure to end the movie, but the way the movie actually ends and all the postscript that happens after the fact about like how this footage was recovered, it's a found footage movie. Something happens tragically to these characters. I love it. I love movies where they take care of the main character at the end and you really don't get a whole lot of explanation. I think it's a great ending. And I think it's probably pretty obvious, but I give Troll Hunter a full hot dog. If you haven't seen this movie, even if you're kind of skeptical or you're like, I've seen found footage movies, they're not for me, I feel like this is one that you should give a shot because it's so far out of the regular kind of movie that we see, especially found footage. It's not so much horror. It's almost like action horror or suspense. I feel like it's a movie that you should give a shot because it's not every day. It's not like run of the mill. It's not like what you expect to see all the time. It has enough of that kind of difference from most found footage that makes it feel fresh to me.
Whose hot dog is this? That's yours?
Nah.
Nah.
Never going to get tired of that. So I'm kind of right there with you. For me, I I mean, to put it out there up front, I would agree this is a full hot dog. Like, yummy down the whole thing and order up a second. Like, it's just, this movie does so many things right. And I don't think I would ever say this is one of my like favorite movies or whatever, but it, from start to finish, it's paced well. It looks great. It's shot in an intriguing way. It draws you in. There's really no big downtime with it. It's a little longer than what I usually like in a movie. It's at an hour 45-ish, right around there. You don't feel it. It feels it like it just moves right along and keeps you drawn in the whole time. The characters are all likable. There's no character in this movie that you're just waiting for a troll to fuck them up. And even when the troll does just go fuck someone up, it's done in a way that's very like entertaining for the audience. You know, it's well done. I think for the most part, the effects hold up really well for what's about a 15-year-old movie now, 25, 15, whatever. I think they hold up pretty well. And I mean, yes, this is a found footage movie. And you said, you know, for those who don't like found footage, I'm that guy that generally doesn't like found footage, or at least doesn't love it. I'll give it a try, but it's not a selling point for me. If you say it's a found footage movie, that usually kind of pushes me in the other direction more than like, oh, I got to see this. But this feels, although it is found footage, feels more at home in like yes, you said the Godzilla and all that type of, or not Godzilla, the governmental conspiracy stuff, all that. But this feels almost more like a small budget Godzilla movie to me. And that's, you know, it's not as destructive as a monster movie like that, but it's got a lot of those same keynotes that just kind of make it click and make it fun. And it's kind of the appeal of this movie. Like, if you like found footage, if you like government conspiracies, if you like monsters, if you like creature features, all these things are not just touched on in this movie. They're touched on and delivered in a satisfying way. And there's not a lot of movies that can do that this effectively, especially on a small budget. So yeah, this is absolutely a movie that if you somehow haven't seen this, I strongly recommend it. I'm not saying it's going to be your new favorite movie, but I honestly think if you're listening to this show now, 100 and almost 60 episodes in, or right around there, this is one of the easiest movies I could say that I would recommend for someone listening to this show of any of the films that we've done. More so than Halloween or Aliens or some of the classic big movies that we've talked about. This is one that kind of flies under the radar. Like, I'm sure there's plenty of people that haven't seen this or don't even know about it because it's a foreign film. But again, I really feel like this pretty much checks off all the boxes. Anything else, or we want to move on to question of the week?
No, I think you hit it on the head. I think there are so many elements of different styles and different genres of movie that this movie covers that I don't want to go so far as to like as Justin on T2, but I feel like this is a movie. There's not a lot of gore. I mean, there is like a little bit of blood, like you mentioned, the Christian blood being spilled on the bridge on purpose. But I feel like this is almost
still
a movie
funny how he does it.
It is, and it's like a gateway. It's like a gateway to horror. It's not so much a gateway, something like Gremlins or like kids to horror, but more so like someone that's not a horror fan to the possibility of watching horror. And I think it's a great gateway to found footage style movies too. And I feel like a lot of them that have bigger budgets don't do it this well.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. It's one of the best arguments you could say that a lack of a budget almost forces creativity and ingenuity. And I don't want to go as far to say that it proves that. Like, I feel like that's probably honestly giving it too much credit, but it's a good example of you don't need to have a $100 million budget to make a really great, infinitely watchable movie that's a lot of fun. And I'd go as far to say this is a movie with big scale aspirations that still does it on a small budget. Question of the week. We did that this week. We didn't do it last week. We did this week. Did we do it last week?
We didn't do it last week.
No, we had guests. We had Boomer last week. This week we said our question of the week is elves, fairies, trolls, ghosts, vampires, or Bigfoot. Which are most likely to be real? What do you think is real? Yeah, something like that. I copied it from what you sent me, so hopefully you typed it right, or I copied it right. Anyway, all those things, all these cryptids, all this shit, what's most likely to be real? We're going to start over on Instagram with Dissect That Film. good friends of the show. Go check them out. He says, I believe in ghosts since I was 5 or 6 years old. Also, I believe in Bigfoot. You can't tell me that every bit of wilderness has been explored. Fair. Can't really argue that. Also, over on Instagram, we have a response from Sam, who is a good friend over at Feature Creatures DTF, and he says, going to go ahead and have to take Ghost on this one. Fair enough. Simple, to the point. We're going to switch gears and go over to Threads, where we have a response from Dave B. Movies, and he says, vampires, surely. So, this will come up again, but I want to ask a question. When you say vampires, do you mean actual lore vampires, like some kind of creature that has powers, or just some dipshit that's biting people and sucking their blood? Because we've had that.
I mean, I would say in the vein of good faith.
The spirit of the question?
Yeah, in the spirit of the question, I would say vampires are more like the creatures of lore, like a Nosferatu or a Bram Stoker's Dracula or a...
Not that dipshit from San Diego or whatever, or was it Sacramento or whatever, that serial killer that was biting people?
I don't know who that was, but I don't know if that was the Night Stalker, if that was the Golden State Killer.
No, he was his own. Hold on.
His own thing? Oh, wow. Sounds like a great guy.
No, but he was kind of a dick, I'm sure. He was Richard Chase, the San Quentin's, or whatever. Vampire of Sacramento. He looks like a dipshit, so dead now.
Oh, Vampire of Sacramento, not a good guy. Wow.
Not a good guy. So, anyway, back to talking lore and other type of dumb shit. Over on Blue Sky, our friend Justin over at Pop Culture Reflections Podcast, you find him on yourunpodcast.com, says, for me, I adamantly believe in both ghosts and Bigfoot and that they are legit. Our friend BP over at Let's Talk Horror says, I've met a few bloodsuckers in my life, so definitely vampires. These fuckers are all out there. Friends over at the Krusty Boys, also on the You Run Podcast Network, says, not to brag, but I'm a size 13.5 wide, so I pretty much am Bigfoot. We know elves exist because of Liv Tyler. All of Tim Burton fans are vampires, and the high school math teachers are trolls, so prove me wrong. So basically, he's saying these things are all out there.
You know what they say about guys with big feet? They wear big shoes.
Well, yeah, 13.5 wide. It's
wide.
Be a good clown shoe.
I knew something about those Krusty Boys. Unsettling.
So last and certainly not least, as mentioned just a few moments ago, Boomer over at Podcast in the Woods, also on the You Run Podcast Network, says, I've done a lot of traipsing? Okay, cut this
That's
out.
a word.
Is that it? Okay. I've done a lot of traipsing around the woods, but I've never seen a Bigfoot. But out of this list, of those other bitches, he's still the one I would most think is real. So Bigfoot. Okay. I can't read. I suck at reading, apparently.
It is fundamental.
It is fundamental. Sean, how about you? What do you think is the most likely cryptid or whatever to actually exist?
I mean, I'm a man of science, right? I'm not a man of faith. I would probably say that the Dewey Lake Monster is the most probable. And I know aliens wasn't in the list. That would open up a whole another bag of
Well, we know those
glass
exist according to the government, so.
Yeah. Well, Troll Hunter told me to not believe anything the government tells me. But yeah, I mean, I could see when I was a kid, I had bureaucracy and all that stuff. They're trying to cover it up.
Shocked you didn't know that before Troll Hunter.
I didn't. I'm very naive. When I was a kid, I used to have night terrors, and I would wake up and I felt like I had night paralysis, wake up and you feel frozen and feel like there's someone in the room with you and stuff. And it was freaky as shit. And I probably would have said at a younger age that I was like a believer in ghosts. But I think when you die, you just close your eyes. It's like you're going for surgery. It's just black and that's it. You don't wake up from it. It's probably pretty peaceful. But
it doesn't sound so bad.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm telling you, being put under is the best sleep I've ever had. I would say that with as much unexplored wilderness that we have, if there's anything that I would believe in, it would be the Dewey Lake Monster or Sasquatch or Bigfoot or Yeti or any of those myriad of, regional cryptids in that large forest ape style persuasion.
So I'm right there with you. It's Bigfoot. I don't believe that vampires are an actual creature. It's just some dipshit trying to bite you and suck on you. Big deal. There's a lot of those out there. Ghosts, I mean, maybe, but at the end of the day, I don't believe it, because I feel like if ghosts were real, it's either one of two things. If I'm a ghost, if ghosts are real, I think it would be unquestioned that we'd be knowing that they exist, not just like questioning it on podcasts and dumb shit. I think if ghosts were real and wanted to fuck with humans, be all kinds of like Ghostbusters nonsense going on 24/7. If I was a ghost and I had the option to come back and haunt people, I'd be stealing their beer, I'd be drinking their whiskey, I'd be shitting in their bed, I'd be doing all kinds of shenanigans that
shaking their bed.
All kinds of shitting in their bed. All kinds of shit. Whatever. Trolls, I don't think trolls are, other than internet trolls, probably not. Fairies, not even going to go there. No. Elves, no. Just no.
Liv Tyler.
So, yeah. I don't believe in Liv or Steven Tyler. They're both made up.
Figments of our imagination.
Just like the TSS. So, anything else you want to tack on with this one?
No.
All right. Well, in that case, we're going to go ahead and wrap for this week. Thank you to anyone who answered the question of the week. You can follow us at all the usual spots. We're on social media at Dewey Podmonster. If you search us and we're not on that network, try another network. We're probably on there, but we're on the majority of them. You can find all of our shows at craft.town or at Rockin' Tomatoes. And of course, you can find our show at yourunpodcast.com. Please, while you're there, check out our show, check out the other shows there. Try something that you haven't tried. There's a lot of good content on there that we would like you to check out. Sean, what am I forgetting?
Well, I'm going to say, if you want your question of the week answer, if you want to answer the great questions like if trolls or fairies or elves or Bigfoots or ghosts or Draculas or maybe zombies exist, you can answer those questions. We ask the hard-hitting questions, so you don't have to. You can just answer them, and they're all available on social media. You're just going to follow us on all the networks or whatever they call these fucking things that John posts to that he cares about. And, we might read your answer. Who knows? You could be internet famous on this podcast, at least for, a whopping week until the next one comes up. If you want to find out,
answer every week.
Well, yeah, there you go. You keep it. Your 15 minutes of fame keeps getting regenerated every time you answer. Or if it's stupid, we just don't post it. And that's fine. I edit around that. Hate to break it to you. It's a fact. Other than that, if you want to find out about any of the stuff that we talked about on this here show, we leave it in the show notes. So if you want to click on any of those links, sometimes they're affiliate links. Usually if they say Amazon afterwards, I got to kind of do that, or else, you can get sued by the government. And it's on there. You click it, you select the thing, you buy something after the fact, or maybe you rent the thing that we linked. We get $1 or $2. It's the best way to support the show, other than leaving reviews and stuff like that on your favorite podcast network. Other than that, if you're interested in my musings and ramblings, I have dropped the Draft Therapy social media. I am now internal-bleeding.bisky.social. If you want to follow me on there, I'm dropping like little cool clips of weird shit that I find around the internet and things that I have purview and access to. So find me there, internal-bleeding.bisky.social. And yeah, I guess you could follow the Draft Therapy shit. It's at youtube.drafttherapy.com.
All right, well, that's it. We'll be back next week. Next week, we'll be tumbling right into Crummy Movie March.